He worked on a wide variety of topics, so metaphors and experimental pragmatics, computational linguistics, and here's a new topic for him, namely on gaslighting and game theory.
Can you actually see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, but I can't see your video.
Can't see my video, yeah. Right. Let's see if my internet holds up. Because it didn't yesterday. Anyway, so yeah, so this is a work with Gela, Roland, and Anton, Jeremy, among other people. So here's a quick roadmap for what's coming up. So we're going to look at a Nash demand game model of gaslighting. Gaslighting being kind of a proxy for oppressive speech. We're going to look at how Nash demand games can be used to model heterogeneous societies, and specifically agents and simulations following social norms in their interactions with other agents. And the way I'm going to go about this in this talk is by, instead of presenting you the full gaslighting model right away, we're going to take it in steps. I'm going to show you a simple model that has social norms and kind of a jury system, some kind of corrective system that tries to enforce the social norms. And then we're going to add different things. We're going to add racist interactions on top of the non-racist interactions, along with racist norms. And then in the full gaslighting model, there's going to be belief updates. So let's see. Right. So a working definition of gaslighting. Gaslighting is the deliberate manipulation of the beliefs of others about their own epistemic state of mind in order to cause a change in the victim's behavior. And there's different aspects that are quite important here that we want to capture in our model. So it's a form of psychological manipulation. Among other things, it can be used to force the perpetrator's own views on their victim by way of the victim engaging in self-censorship. So that's kind of the perverse twist of gaslighting, that the perpetrator actually causes the victim to act in a certain way without the victim actually realizing that that is what they're doing. It avoids open confrontation and as such is less publicly visible, which is also quite important for gaslighting. I mean, nowadays people are much more sensitive to this, but mostly this is kind of a private matter. And then importantly, language is the primary tool of the gaslighter in manipulating their victims' belief states. So really the question is, we're thinking of gaslighting as maybe just one characteristic of oppressive speech. So here I'm just comparing different aspects that gaslighting and oppressive speech have in common. So they're both using language. They both have a psychological impact. Gaslighting is trying to manipulate the victim's beliefs, but importantly, it's covert. Oppressive speech is also trying to influence the victim's beliefs or change them. But with oppressive speech, it seems to be primarily about psychological intimidation. Whereas with gaslighting, you want to be covert, so you don't want the intimidation to be obvious. So that's maybe an important difference. They're both definitely about role assignment and assertion of power in the way that Michaela talked about it yesterday. So there's a back and forth between social roles and conversational roles and back to social roles. Um, they're both about reinforcing or enforcing certain beliefs. In the case of oppressive speech, those beliefs are most definitely prejudiced. In gaslighting, it can be all sorts of beliefs, mostly, um, yeah, whatever the perpetrator is trying to convince the victim of. Um, but still, it's very similar, right? So what you're trying to do is, in both cases, you're trying to do these belief updates. So you're trying to convince the victim that things aren't the way they originally thought they were, and you're trying to replace them with your view of the world, with your beliefs. And this can either be sort of entirely replacing beliefs, or it can be sort of a partial replacement. And in both cases, it's not so important that you manage to entirely convince the victim. Oftentimes, the perpetrator will be happy with the result if they sort of change the beliefs of the victim enough so that they nudge them in the direction where they behave the way they want them to behave. Um, and then something that uh, is also quite important, and people often forget when they talk about gaslighting and oppressive speech, is that they both have a social function. So it's not just about the perpetrator and the victim, it's also about bystanders and other people witnessing this, because in both cases, the perpetrator is sending a social signal to potentially like-minded people, um, because these people would then sort of join in and put even more peer pressure on the victim, which is kind of an interesting aspect that a lot of gaslighters will use, because if it's not just the perpetrator's beliefs, so it's not just uh, one person's opinion about how to interpret things against another person's beliefs, but it's a whole group of people. The victim is sort of intimidated and sort of feeling like, oh, if I'm the only one who's potentially mistaken about how to interpret this situation, then maybe the perpetrator is right in how they're presenting the state of affairs. And then the victim is more willing to sort of give in to the peer pressure and take on the perpetrator's beliefs. So uh, those are some of the crucial things for in how we're modeling this. It's obviously not exhaustive. There's different details. And getting more technical, we could think about gaslighting as manipulative belief updates in kind of a Bayesian way. Remember, I said the beliefs don't have to uh, be entirely replaced, so not completely erasing the victim's prior beliefs and replacing them with the perpetrator's beliefs. It could be a gradual nudge in a certain direction. So that makes them kind of similar to Bayesian belief updates as incremental changes. And yeah, so the three important aspects uh, about gaslighting and what gaslighting does is it's an assertion of power over victims, it's reinforcing certain worldviews, and it's a rallying call. So it has this social function um, where it signals to bystanders. So the other big issue that is important for the Nash Demand games that I'm presenting is how do we model social norms? And we want to think about this in terms of a dichotomy. So we want to have positive social norms and negative social norms, because in both the case of gaslighting and oppressive speech, what the perpetrator is doing is they're going against some mainstream notion, some view of the world that the majority of normal people would usually assert uh, and assume. And so we need this kind of dichotomy, and I've sort of thrown in some buzzwords here. I'm going to explain what this jury is in a bit, but uh, the idea is that you have a social group that reinforces adherence to a mainstream social norm through moderation and tolerance. And opposed to that is what the perpetrators, the gaslighters, and the racists are doing, the rogue agents in the simulations, because they're striving for divergence from the mainstream social norm through provocation, escalation, or intimidation, or whatever you want to call it. So we need at least the following minimal requirements in the model. It needs to be a multi-agent simulation with different social groups. We need to have different social norms, at least two, one positive, the other negative. And then we need to have rogue agents that belong to one of the social groups, but use some mechanism that resembles provocation, transgression, or intimidation. And in order to go against the mainstream, to provoke, to transgress, requires rules or those set norms. And there needs to be a way to break these rules. And then we need an authority that usually tries to reinforce the rules. And that's the jury that I'm going to be talking about. So the idea here is very similar to a court setting, that whoever is interacting, there's always bystanders in the simulations, and these bystanders judge the behavior of the two agents interacting. So that's the idea of the jury here. So those interactions can involve some form of provocation, and then the jury is going to form an opinion about how they think about this provocation, and whether they want to punish the use of provocation or not, or maybe even reward it. So that's sort of the idea. And then obviously, for those of you who were here yesterday, I can go over this quickly. Over the years been many different kinds of Nash demand games developed. Originally, they were only trying to model power imbalances between individuals. There's also multi-agent Nash demand games where you have power imbalances between groups of agents. And the way, just to recap, the way you capture power imbalances in these Nash demand games is by giving different agents or different groups of agents different disagreement points. Yeah, and crucially for the gaslighting model, we're not going to be. We also need a way to update beliefs. So on top of the disagreement points or some way of capturing bargaining power in the Nash demand games, we also add belief states and updates of beliefs. So just to sort of recap again, what a Nash demand game is, it's two agents or players fighting over a common resource by making bids for their share in the resource. When they fail to get the share they wanted, because their bid summed up with the other bids exceeds the total resource available, they get a consolation prize called disagreement point. And the power imbalance between players is modeled as a difference in players' disagreement points. The player with less to lose has more power. So that's the basic idea. And what we're interested in is, similar to the simulations we saw yesterday, is always which of the Nash equilibria the models converge to. And the important one is the one that is fair to both groups. So assume we have two groups. We have red players and blue players. They can maximize their potential payoffs if both of them get half of whatever the resource is that they're trying to share. And then there's a strategy in equilibrium which would be in favor of the red players, and one that would be in favor of the blue players. So back to the social norms, because this is quite important how we do this in a Nash demand game. So oppression and oppressive speech is based on ideological views dividing the world into superior and inferior groups. So that straight away gives us an easy way to think of discrimination in this model, and to think of social norms that would encapsulate discrimination. And obviously, the alternative would be some notion of equality along the lines of treat everyone the same. So whether a social norm is mainstream, obviously, can be modeled as how many agents in the population of agents follow a norm. If the majority follow a certain norm, that's the mainstream social norm in the simulation, in the game. And since a Nash domain game is bidding war, that's crucial here, over shared resources, the norms we model concern fairness in bidding. So fairness of bidding in these models is a proxy for social norm of equality. So what's actually happening in the simulations is that we're treating this social norm of equality, treat everyone the same, and we're modeling it as make bids as if the other agents had the same bargaining power as you. So if they were weaker, meaning they had less bargaining power, um, this notion of fairness or equality means that you're not taking advantage of that lower bargaining power by outbidding them. And similarly, discrimination as a norm is modeled as um, taking advantage of other agents' weaknesses in bargaining power because of their belonging to a specific social group. So next, we're going to start looking at the individual models. Just to recap, we start with a simple model that has different social norms. It has a jury system that judges the behavior of agents in the interactions on every turn. And the jury is trying to reinforce the social norms depending on the makeup of the jury, like whether members of the jury are following a certain social norm or another social norm. And then the second model is going to add racist norms and racist interactions. And it's going to give the racists the ability to take away bargaining power. The examples, like real world examples you might think of, are cases where a landlord doesn't want to maybe rent to an LGBTQ person uh, because of their sexuality. Um, it could be it could be red tape. A black person is denied a mortgage loan by a bank because the bank thinks that white people are more likely to not default on the loan, something along those lines. And so a case where, objectively speaking, the perpetrator has the ability to take away bargaining power, and the jury, very much like a real jury, then can rule to give back bargaining power to the victim. And then in the third game, instead of giving the racist the ability to update bargaining power, to take away bargaining power, um, what they're doing is they're gaslighting, they're changing the beliefs about bargaining power. And importantly, Roland yesterday showed when and under which conditions Nash demand games evolve towards a fair strategy. So you start from randomness or something, and then you see under which conditions the fair MM Nash equilibrium evolves, the Nash equilibrium that is beneficial to both the social groups, the reds and the blues. But in this talk, I'm presenting Nash demand games where we look at the opposite, where we look at when and under which conditions rogue agents manage to destabilize a fair society. So we start from a fair Nash equilibrium, and then we see how much impact the racists need to have, how much influence they need to exert on this society for this society to devolve into an unfair one, which I think is probably quite interesting to see. So the first model, just to be a bit more specific, what it does and what it can do and what it cannot do, is it's a multi-agent Nash demand game. It has two social groups, the reds and the blues. Um, the bargaining power via the disagreement points is fixed initially, but is dynamic afterwards. Each agent is randomly paired for interaction with red and blue agents, so agents from both groups. We don't only have red-blue interactions, you have red-red interactions and blue-blue interactions. And as Roland said yesterday, what the agents learn, what the evolution of the simulation does, they converge on conditional strategies. So behaving based on group membership mostly. And then we have two social norms, equality and discrimination, formulated in the way that I presented earlier. So equality means treat out-group agents like in-group agents. So they're not distinguishing who they're interacting with. Whereas the agents who do discriminate, they see the group differences and they treat them differently. And this is done via the memories used in the payoff calculation. So for those of you not familiar, in the Nash demand games, you try to maximize your payoff, obviously. And you do that by anticipating what the potential next move of an opponent is. And you do that by looking at your memories of past interactions with this sort of agent. So if you have different memories for your interactions with red and blue agents, then if you think of one group as your enemy, you can you prepare differently for how you make bids with your enemies than with your friends. So if you do discriminate, the agents in the Nash demand game behave differently because of these memories. And agents who follow this norm of equality, they have one joint memory where it has both red and blue agents. So it's all one and the same. And this is how sort of the social norm is implemented. So what else is important? Yeah, so the jury is pooled from the population at random, obviously. And the important thing is in this one, it has the machinery to allow for discrimination point updates. So to transfer bargaining power, to give bargaining power by rewarding agents for their actions, or to take bargaining power from them, thereby punishing them for their behavior. But the only way to do this is through the jury. So the jury looks at every interaction between red and blue agents, or red agents and blue agents, and then decides whether to reward the interaction or to punish the interaction. And it can decide to take away power from one agent and give it to the other agent, let's say. So even if you had racists in this simulation, that followed this norm of discrimination, they can only influence by being jurors. So they can only have an indirect influence because they're only going to be one of many jurors in the jury. So they only have a very small influence, if any. And here we get to the results. What I'm doing in these different graphs is I'm looking at 100 runs of the simulation each, and then I'm increasing the number of races, and we're looking at the emergence, or whether the fair Nash equilibrium is stable. So that's the green one, and we see it's 100% in every single one of these. So no matter how many races we have, we always remain stable at the fair Nash equilibrium. And what the box plots show is the variance among the final disagreement points. Remember, in this model, the jury can update the bargaining power. Updating bargaining power means changing the disagreement points. So as the simulation progresses and agents interact with one another, they can lose or gain bargaining power. And what we see is there's a blue group of non-racist blue agents. There's a red group of non-racist red agents, and the yellow one in the middle, that's the group of racists, which becomes bigger over time. And we see that if we start all of the different groups with a disagreement point of 4, at the end, the median is still at 4. So having this jury and having no way for the racists to actually take bargaining power, to actually openly discriminate against other agents, prevents them from taking over this society and destabilizing it. So in model 2, what we're changing is we're giving the racists the ability to take bargaining power from red agents. So now we're making some blue agents racist. And that means they can lower the disagreement point of a red agent when they get to interact with that red agent. And this setup is slightly more complicated. The x-axis is still the proportion of races. So left to right, we're going from having few races to having 80% of the population be racist. And then on the y-axis, we're going from, we're looking at the impact of discrimination. So how much bargaining power the racists can take from a red agent whenever they interact with them. So on the bottom, it's 0, so they can't take anything from them. At the top, they can take 1 full disagreement point. They can lower the red agent's disagreement point by 1. And what we see is quite interesting, because in the top right corner, obviously, if we have a lot of racists and they can take a lot of bargaining power, it's not surprising that the Nash equilibrium is only 52% of the time the final state of the simulation. 43% of the time, it's not in equilibrium anymore. The society has destabilized. And we see that the red agents at the end, even though they started out the same as the blue agents, at a disagreement point of 4, the racists have taken bargaining power from them to the point where they're almost 2 disagreement points lower. But the jury has also punished the racists for doing so, for discriminating. But the interesting thing is, even if we have 80% racists, but we only give the racists a little less power in discriminating, then it seems like we're still in the Nash equilibrium. The simulation still ends up in the Nash equilibrium 100% of the time, but the red agents are still disadvantaged. So looking at the Nash equilibria is kind of misleading, because the Nash equilibrium is saying this is a fair society, but if we actually look at the bargaining power that the red agents have at the end of the simulation after they had racist interactions, we see that because most of the society, 80% are racist, the jury doesn't even punish the racists as much as it does up here, and the red agents are still disadvantaged. So question is this kind of society even fair if the Nash equilibrium says it should be, because the red agents are at a greater risk? And obviously what we're arguing is no, it's not. So there's something interesting going on where looking at the Nash equilibria is not that informative. And now the third model, instead of the racists being able to take bargaining power from red agents, meaning lowering their disagreement points, in the third model, they cannot do that anymore. They can only use gaslighting. And gaslighting means they can change, upon interacting with them, they can change the belief updates of red agents by making them, or convincing the red agents, the red victims, that they have less bargaining power than they actually have. And they can, again, only change that incrementally. So they can sort of chip away at the self-esteem of the red agents a little bit and make them think that their bargaining power is a little less than what they think it is. So these plots have the same setup. On the x-axis, we're increasing from having few races to having a lot of races in the population. And then on the y-axis, we're increasing the strength of gaslighting. So how much lower the red agents will think their bargaining power is each time that they become a victim of gaslighting. And again, on the top right corner, we see more than half of the time, at the end of the simulation, the Nash demand game is no longer in a fair Nash equilibrium. The red agents have been disadvantaged more so than the blue agents and the racists. The jury has not managed to punish the racists because they still have pretty much the same power that they started out with, and they still are as powerful as their fellow blue agents. But interestingly, The red agents also are disadvantaged in other cases where, again, the Nash equilibrium is suggesting it arises 64% of the time, 80% of the time, 79% of the time, but we can clearly see that the red agents have a lower disagreement point than blue agents and racists. So they are disadvantaged, even though the equilibrium is saying that this should be a fair society. So although it is true that as long as there are a few races, equality is the mainstream norm, and the society is stable in the Nash equilibrium, red agents are disadvantaged out of underestimating their own bargaining power, and society as a whole fails to see why reds behave that way. So yeah, let's get to the conclusion. Gaslighting, as we see, has a destabilizing effect on a fair society, similar to material oppression, the kind of discrimination, the open discrimination we try to capture in the second model, where races could take bargaining power from their opponents. And interestingly, even when the society as a whole appears to be fair, looking at the Nash equilibria, racist agents can use gaslighting to systematically disadvantage the oppressed because of two things that happen in tandem and create sort of a feedback loop. So on the one hand, what happens is that the oppressed behave less assertive than members of the other social group because of false beliefs about their bargaining power, right? Remember in the Nash demand game, assertiveness, how high the agents make their bids is solely based on their bargaining power. So if they have more bargaining power, the agents get more bold, more assertive. And if they have lower bargaining power, they get less assertive. And the other thing that happens is society as a whole comes to expect this subservient behavior of the oppressed, of the red agents, because of the memories and how that affects the calculation of expected payoffs. So once destabilized, once society is destabilized, it becomes entrenched. And this obviously reeks of systemic racism or sexism, which would be sort of real world examples for this. It could be police being more likely to check on a Black person. It could be women having lower incomes on average because society thinks of them as being less assertive in negotiating higher pay, things like that. So the crucial thing is how this happens in the simulations. And it's about the jury system. The jury system is not enough to counteract this because there's a disconnect between what the jury system is trying to do and what is actually the root cause of the problem. So the jury is trying to treat the symptoms rather than the root cause, right? So in the gaslighting model, because gaslighting is psychological, has a psychological impact, what the jury system is trying to do is similar to compensating victims for their psychological damages. So it's giving them bargaining power to make up for their lowered self-esteem in a way, which sort of misses the root cause. And in the second model, interestingly enough, the jury also fails for the very same reason, right? Because victimhood, rather than the lack of resources, leads to less assertiveness, right? Because once the red agents have become victims of racists, they get fearful that other blue agents they encounter might be racist. So they act less assertive, they make lower bids. The jury sees that they make lower bids, but doesn't understand why they made lower bids. So the jury gives the victims bargaining power to make them more assertive next time. But the victims still have the memory of encountering racists. So even though they have more bargaining power than last time,
come to an end.
Yeah. Even though they have less bargaining power next time, they still act less assertive because the memories in the payoff expectation calculation have been altered by being a victim. And we're done.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so the floor is open for questions. So please use the chat. If you have a question, just type Q or question or something. So that's the easiest way to see you. So Kevin has a question.
Yeah, thanks. This is really interesting. I think it's a really interesting model, especially thinking about how we might, how one can influence someone else via their disagreement point. I really like that idea. I think that one of the things that I sort of wonder about this as a model of discrimination is let me just raise maybe a worry, or at least an additional wrinkle, which maybe is just not worth including in the model. But one of the things that about discriminatory social norms is that discriminatory social norms really do impact genuinely people's disagreement points. So, in particular, when you think about like women's position and bargaining within the family, that's a situation where the fact that women were relegated to only household labor and had very little market power in, say, the 1950s culture, then they in fact did have a very poor disagreement point. So it wasn't gaslighting, right? It was discrimination, but it wasn't gaslighting, right? It was that they genuinely had very poor bargaining power outside of the family. And so they had to accept subservient roles within the family precisely because a woman who divorced her husband was in an incredibly poor financial position economically. And so I guess the question I have here is if the primary target is the evolution of unfair bargaining, do you think it's right to think about this as gaslighting, where it is I'm manipulating your impression of your true bargaining power versus just outright taking away your bargaining power? That is truly moving your disagreement point.
I mean, that's actually why we looked at where we did the second model as well. And the second model is the one where you can take actual bargaining power away from them. I mean, the way it's set up in the second model is obviously the perpetrator can maliciously take bargaining power without the victim doing something wrong. So they're kind of helpless, which might not be quite realistic. Maybe you could have a model where the victim becomes the victim of having bargaining power taken from them because of their choices and not about the choice of the perpetrator. Yeah, but sort of the second model is trying to model kind of a 1950s sexism option, saying like what these rogue agents that follow these discrimination rules, these discrimination norms, are doing is they are influencing society as a whole. So even though society might have agents that are liberal in the sense that they would give equal power to women, let's say the red agents, if they are the women in this case, but if there's only a few men who think that they shouldn't, they can influence via the jury and via taking power from the women directly and turn this society into an unfair one. So sort of the second model is trying to model kind of an maybe 1950s similar setup, whereas the gaslighting model maybe is more trying to model a more modern state of, let's say, American society, where the laws make it so that you don't have 1950s situation for women. There's lots of laws for equal opportunity in the workplace, but still you have systemic sexism. You still have problems where society as a whole thinks that some jobs are more lenient towards women. I'm thinking of like nursing and that sort of thing, or the examples we had yesterday with the who does the lawn work and who does other kinds of housework. And sort of the gaslighting model is trying to get at these setups where you do have, objectively speaking, an equal distribution of bargaining power at the start, but then something happens psychologically that victimizes one social group, and then they behave in a slightly different way that disadvantages them. So they're kind of disadvantaging themselves, if that makes sense. And maybe gaslighting is not the right heading for this. Maybe it's something different, but that's sort of the idea of the third model versus the second model.
Yeah, thank you. Edgar Ania had a question.
Oh, I did actually type it into the chat, so I just didn't understand how exactly did you model the belief that you have less bargaining power. So how was this implemented in terms of the simulation? What effects did it have for individual decisions? Can you explain that a little bit?
So say that again. Which?
So when you believe that you don't have so much bargaining power as you actually do,
so
how does this impact the simulation in practical terms? So what can you do? What are your options?
You mean what options the victims have?
Right. So how did you implement it in the program, basically?
Yeah.
This concept.
So basically what's happening is the beliefs are a copy of the payoff matrix. So they start out having objective beliefs about what their bargaining power is. And then when they encounter a gaslighter, their belief, what they believe their disagreement point to be, is lowered. What they can do about becoming a victim, in this version of the simulation, they can't do anything about it. So what is supposed to change that is the jury giving them more material bargaining power, actual bargaining power, which would then still cause them to behave slightly more assertive, and as an effect of them being more successful in the bidding, they might update their beliefs again. But that's the basic setup. So right now they don't have, the victims don't have a way to sort of mend their psychological damages. They can't say, oh, my belief about what a disagreement point is has been lowered, so I'm going to correct for that. They don't have a direct way to do that. So it's sort of an indirect feedback loop via how successful they are in interactions. Does that answer your question, or?
Well, only in part, because I didn't fully understand how the decisions are made by the agents, but maybe that is too technical. So I didn't fully understand how their beliefs affect their decisions exactly as compared to the objective facts. So if you believe that you have less bargaining power, then you will make a different bid, I assume. But isn't that just, so what you believe your bargaining power to be, isn't that just kind of a cap on what you can bid anyway? So where is then the difference between having less bargaining power objectively, just believing it, but maybe I just missed some part of the technical thing that I have to work through.
Yeah, I mean, we could go over the details, but that's probably going to take up too much time. But that is an important point, right? It's like so to make this more realistic, you definitely need to think about more about, and that's maybe not worked out in this model quite as well. How do you deal with having an objective view on the one hand actual bargaining power that the victims are still aware of. They know what they can bid and what they can't bid, but they also have this psychological aspect to it, these beliefs about it.
Right. So my question was, what would then, in a mathematical sense, be the difference in their decisions? So what is the factor that decides? But maybe I can look at some version of it where you see the details.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, what's driving it in this version is definitely the beliefs. So in a way, the beliefs are doing most of the work, and it's kind of like, that they're acting what they think their bargaining power is rather than what their actual bargaining power is.
Right. And so basically then I just don't fully understand how it comes about that you have different results in the two simulations. So what is the cause of that difference? So in the model 2 and 3, I mean.
Yeah, we don't understand it either. So this is kind of fresh results yet, and we haven't quite tested all of the dimensions of the simulation because there's so many factors going on. It might be kind of a weird feedback loop that's happening with the jury as well. So we haven't fully tested all of the limits of the simulation yet.
But I'm finishing in a second. But it's true that you cannot believe that you have more bargaining power than you actually have. Is it possible in this model?
No. Oh yeah.
Okay,
so now I
I
understand what.
I think now that explains it to me. So there's the potential difference then. Okay, I got it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, we have a question by Johanna Mom.
Yes, it's just that, like I wrote, I wanted to ask, is there like a way to implement a change of worldview? Like, for example, that people who are actually affected by gaslighting can spread the belief to others. So what I feel is sometimes the case that people who are affected by racism or sexism can internalize these beliefs and then spread these to others, and thus making it more like a kind of racist or sexist epidemic in a sense. And also then on the other hand, you can via arguments or whatever also change the beliefs of racists, so they kind of change their way of argumenting, and if that could be implemented in this model as well.
So in a way, the jury is trying to correct behavior, right? So the jury is trying to punish the racists by taking actual bargaining power away from them whenever they see them perform gaslighting. So that's going on. If this is pushed to the limit, the racists, that the gaslighters should stop gaslighting. So that's one way to correct that behavior. As for the victims, it's not like the victims can influence other agents, and sort of like the real world analogy to sort of telling their story and then other people being more sensitive to the issue. It's like, so there's no spreading of beliefs from one agent to another outside of an individual interaction with a potential gaslighter or not. On the other hand, obviously, if someone becomes the victim of gaslighting and then gets to be a jury member next time and over again, they can sort of influence it. So if you have a lot of gaslighters in the simulation, and thus you have a lot of victims, or very quickly every red agent becomes a victim of gaslighting, then every time red agents are jury members or jurors, they project that view onto the verdict that they pass, obviously, to the gaslighters or other blue agents, their fear of every blue agent being a gaslighter. So in a way, it can sort of spread through this jury system, through that mechanism. But there's no way of sort of one agent telling their story of how they became a victim of gaslighting to another agent, and that agent causes, which would cause the other agent to change their beliefs. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Are there more questions? So we have still 10 minutes for questions. Roland has a question.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the talk. As you know, I know your model very well, and it just came while I was listening to you an idea to my mind, and maybe you have an opinion what kind of impact that would have. So right now the model is sampling the jury. It's just a random sample of the population. And I was thinking it might maybe make sense to make a weighted sample that is weighted with respect to the disagreement point. Because if disagreement point stands for, you know, how much power or influence you have, then it might be that the more powerful have somehow more to say or more impact also on how to judge behavior in the society. So, and I was wondering if you have thought about this idea and if you think it might change the results of the simulation.
So all of the mechanics are there because I did think about it. I haven't dared to actually run it extensively to see what happens. As you know, it's always a matter of sort of fine tuning it. So it's all set up. You can in the random sampling, you can say make it more likely for blue agents to be in the jury than for red agents to be in the jury. It would be very simple thing of a minute to use the bargaining power as weights. The question really is, you probably need some scaling factor to sort of mitigate the effects. I think if you just one-to-one map it to weights in the jury, that might be too strong, because then you have very powerful agents and then pretty much no red agents in the jury. That's sort of my fear, looking at the numbers. But all of the mechanics are set up. It's just a matter of us linking or saying what we want the weights to be.
Maybe one follow-up thing. So because I was thinking of that, it might produce more interesting dynamics. For example, if the racists manage to, lowering the bargaining power of the non-racists so far that they have kind of more voice in the jury, that maybe you could, in some extreme cases, have as a result maybe evolution of a racistic, fascistic kind of a government or state, who is then really suppressing, any other word of the suppressed. At one extreme example, or exactly the opposite, that kind of racists have completely no word in it and are completely brand marked by society. Or what you see in most liberal societies, or you got a split society, what you often see. So I was just thinking that maybe you got more, you could get some dynamics in more extreme directions. This might be interesting, I think. Yeah, and would also tell us what we have to take care of to avoid this, unwanted outcomes.
Yeah, right now mostly the story is about having a jury that tries to give victims more bargaining power as a compensation for their changed belief states is not the right approach. And we see this in the real world as well, right? With psychological damages and in giving money to people to cope with psychological damages doesn't seem to get at the root cause. Because you can't take away the fact that someone became a victim of oppression. And no money in the world or no bargaining power, however you want to whatever your form of compensation is in the real world. Like nothing is going to make up for the fact, because you can't go back in time and undo what happened to you, make it so it never happened. With making it even more extreme towards fascism, for sure. I mean, that could be interesting. In a way, when you in the setups where we have like 80% racists, we can see that already. Notice in those graphs, they are. Let's see. Let me show you those graphs again. So in those graphs where we do have, where is it now? Yeah, where we do have 80% racists, notice how in this case, and in this case, well, they're not in the fair equilibrium anymore, so it doesn't seem like a fair society. But notice how the racists are not getting punished. They still have the same bargaining power as the other non-racist blue agents, and that's because the majority of society is racist, so or are gaslighters. So 80% of the jury, or like 40% of the jury, are gaslighters, so they're not punishing one another. So whenever the jury looks at a gaslighting incident, there's so many gaslighters in the jury that they're not going to punish the gaslighter, right? So this is kind of a setup for a fascist society in the setup. It would be interesting to see how this evolves. For sure.
Yeah.
So
in this, yeah, exactly in this example, top right, if you would weight set the jury with the weighted members, then you would even have less of the reds and more of the blues and yellows, and you probably would have, now you have 29% the pro-blue norm to emerge, maybe would emerge even more often, and fair society,
yeah,
much less. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah, maybe I have a very short question, so if you can answer shortly. So as I understand it, so in most simulations, the game ends up in the MM, so in the fair distribution. And so you could argue the only thing that I'm interested in as a player is to get in the end the same share of the pie. So I want to have the half of it, and the other half is for the other one. So if most of the time the fair distribution emerges, so in which sense is manipulating the disagreement point suppression or oppression of a person? And if he gets in the end the same share, then maybe it's a bit more exciting for him to play the game, because he cannot be so sure to get his fair share. But yeah, especially this graph that you bring here. So it seems, except for the one right corner right up there, that you always have a fair distribution.
Yeah, sort of, we made the selection. So this is showing 20%, 40%, and then it jumps all the way to 80%. Because 60% looks exactly the same as 40%. So it definitely has something to do with the makeup of the jury, where the tipping point is, do you have more than half of the jurors being racist or not? That is the tipping point. And in terms of bargaining power as an incentive, I mean, it might be interesting to see what happens. So this is a multi-agent, multiple rounds of interaction. What happens if they're sort of accumulating resources? So every time they are successful, they get a bit of resource, they get a share of the resource, and then they try to accumulate as much as possible over time, over many rounds of simulation. Maybe that would address the issue that you had. Because now right now it's more like a like a two-player Nash demand game where they just try to maximize the payoff on each interaction, and they're not being so strategic about the game overall, the multiple rounds of interactions.
Okay, I probably have to read the details of the model to understand it fully. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the discussion time, and we have a 10 minutes break, and thank the speaker again. And yeah, so see you all back in 10 minutes with the next talk by Kevin.